The story of Henry VIII, also known as How to Ruin England with Six Wives and a Lot of Ego. Once upon a time, in the cold mists of 1491 England, a boy was born with a great destiny and, probably, a satisfied expression on his newborn face. His name was Henry Tudor, second son of the severe Henry VII and his gentle wife Isabel of York, a political marriage destined to end the War of the Roses, because nothing says more romance than a civil war and strategic unions. Now, little Henry was not destined to be king. That position was reserved for his older brother Arthur. Yes, like the legend of Arthur, because the Tudors were obsessed with public relations, even in that era, but life and tuberculosis had other plans. Poor Arthur married the Spanish princess Catalina de Aragon and died at the age of 15, leaving his little brother as heir to the throne and his widow. The classic Henry, taking what is not his even before is fashionable. But let's not rush. First, let's meet young Henry. He was tall. He measured more than 180 m, which was basically the height of the NBA in the era of Tudor. He had broad shoulders, blonde hair like polished mahogany, and those piercing blue eyes that screamed, "One day, I will execute you if you don't agree with me." He was handsome, athletic, and gave off a slight aroma of ambition and roasted venison. Young Henry was also very cultured. Latin, French, theology, music, poetry. He knew everything. He wrote sonnets, played the lute, fought with the courtiers, and participated in just with a sword in one hand and divine right in the other. Basically, he was a Renaissance heartthrob with a god complex. Now, his father, Henry VII, was as exciting as a cold boiled potato, gray and distrustful of everyone. So when Henry VII kicked the bucket in 1509, 17-year-old Henry VIII ascended the throne with a great spark in his eyes and a desire to party. He was ready to be the king of kings. And what was the first thing he did? Organize a wild coronation, distribute wealth to the poor, and dance twerk in tights. No, dear dreamer, he married Catalina de Aragon. Yes, the same Catalina, his brother's widow, and so began one of the most infamous marital roller coasters in history, worthy of an opera. But let's leave that for now. Let's talk about what kind of King Henry was becoming at the beginning. Henry was adored, energetic, generous, and obsessed with chivalry, pomp, and being considered the most magnificent monarch in Europe. He organized banquets that would make Vago blush. Imagine roasted swans, fountains of wine, and more velvet than a medieval boy band. He loved music, and he composed it. In fact, one of his best-known songs is called Pastime with Good Company, which is exactly what he wanted his court to be. Too bad he would later fill it with flatterers, spies, and cut heads. But hey, who hasn't changed their image at 40? Henry also adored sports. Jousting, yes. Hunting, obviously. Tennis, of course, although real tennis, which is much more confusing and medieval than modern. He was basically a gym addict with a crown. Henry began as the most devout Catholic. He even wrote a treatise attacking Martin Luther and defending the Pope, which earned him the title of Defender of the Faith. Spoiler. He would later tear off that title and throw it into the religious bonfire of his personal life. Henry believed he was the king chosen by God, which, unfortunately, meant that everything he wanted had to be morally right, even when it was morally catastrophic. In the late 30s, Henry's brilliant golden prince image began to tarnish. He was still intelligent, powerful, and lion-like, but now he was also impatient, distrustful, and increasingly tyrannical. He deeply believed in his own greatness, and that anyone who didn't repeat it with their head was an idiot. So, who really was Henry? He was a child who was never destined to be king, a young man who dazzled with promise and power, a ruler who craved a legacy, glory, and a son more than the truth, who loved music, theology, armor, and women, but not all at once, and who believed until the end that everything he did was not only right, but was ordained by God, even if it meant rewriting religion, reshaping England, and reducing his wives to a rhyme. The Six Wives of Henry VIII, a royal alignment of love, loss, and madness. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Catchy, right? That little rhyme has resonated through time, appearing in both textbooks and musicals, reducing six complex intelligent and fascinating women to 6 brutal destinies. But behind that rhyme lies a whole life of drama, betrayal, passion, religion, politics, and a man's confusing relationship with women, power, and his own legacy. Let's light a candle and go through them. Shall we start? Catalina de Aragon, divorced, the original queen of Spanish royalty, dignified and deeply devout, loved Henry, respected the crown, and gave Maria, but no son survived for almost 2 decades. She held the throne with grace, but her greatest sin in Henry's eyes was being too old to give him a son and too proud to step aside when she refused to disappear in silence. He broke with the Pope, created the Church of England, and dethroned her. Honestly, iconic behavior on both sides. And Boleyn, beheaded, witty, scathing, and ambitious, who was not going to be anyone's mistress. She wanted the crown and got it. But the same charm that captivated Henry began to threaten him. She gave him Isabel, but she didn't give him a son. Accusations flew. Adultery, incest, treason, mostly false, unless you believe the most dramatic theories. In the midst of a court drama, Henry had her executed. Her head may have rolled, but her daughter would one day wear the crown. Jane Seymour died. Sweet, quiet peacemaker Jane was everything and wasn't. Submissive, soft-spoken, Henry loved her more, or so he said. Why? Because he gave her to his precious son, Edward V, and then conveniently died of postpartum complications before she could bother him. He buried her next to him, which is romantic in the sense of my favorite wife is the one who never disagreed with me. And of Cleves, divorced. Ah, sweet, and the deceived bride. Henry chose her based on a flattering portrait, met her in person, and quickly declared that she looked like a mare of Flanders. Alas, their marriage was never consummated. No wonder he was angry like a little boy who had a toy taken away. But and played her cards like a professional. She agreed to the divorce, accepted a generous settlement agreement, and lived happily ever after as the king's beloved sister, with a mansion and no stress. Honestly, she won. Catherine Howard was beheaded as a teenager, a flirt, a tragic firework. Catherine was Ben's cousin and possibly one of the most misguided. He was almost 50 years old, and she was perhaps 17. She brought excitement to his aging court, but her past and possibly her current lovers betrayed her when Henry found out. He cried and then executed her, very much in his style. Catherine Parr outlived the last wife, educated, patient, and smart enough to stay alive. Catherine was more of a nurse than a lover. Henry was bloated, angry, and full of ulcers by then. She took care of his children, calmed his temper, and discreetly stayed in his grace while secretly promoting the Protestant Reformation. She outlived him and then remarried like a boss. There you have it. 6 women, 6 very different destinies, a very dramatic king. And through it all, Henry changed not only his wives, but also his country, his religion, and himself. What began as the story of a golden prince became a Shakespearean epic full of heartbreak, ambition, and absurdly puffed sleeves. But don't worry, dear dreamer, this is just the beginning. Now that you have met the man and glimpsed his queens, we will take each of their hands and go through their stories one by one, each a tapestry in itself. Catherine of Aragon, Queen of Hearts, first wife, an unwavering icon of the Tudor court. Once upon a time, long before England even thought about arguing with the Pope about divorce, a girl wrapped in silk and royal expectations was born in Spain. It was the year 1485, and her name was Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella, queen of the hairy women of Castile. Yes, that Isabella and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs who expelled the Moors from Spain, financed Christopher Columbus, and had a very busy time reinventing Catholic Europe. Catherine was a princess from birth, a warrior by blood, and a queen by destiny from the moment she could take her first steps through the palace. Catherine was prepared for greatness. She studied Latin, philosophy, history, music, and theology, and she probably could have won a debate against a monk before reaching puberty. She was also raised in an environment of great religious intensity. The Spain of that time was immersed in the Crusades, and Catherine assimilated the belief that her role in life was to serve God and the crown. Also, not to brag, She spoke Latin fluently, rode a horse like a champion, and knew how to sew, dance, and pray, all before lunch at the tender age of 15. Catherine crossed the sea to marry Prince Arthur, heir to the throne of England and older brother of Henry VII. The wedding was grand, the politics were even more so, and everyone expected a long and fruitful royal future. Instead, Arthur died 5 months later. Was it tuberculosis? The humid climate and bland food of England? The fact that they were literally teenagers forced into a political honeymoon? Perhaps we will never know, but what we do know is that Catherine, widowed and abandoned in a strange and cold land, declared that the marriage had never been consummated. That phrase would mark the rest of her life. After Arthur's death, poor Catherine was trapped in a miserable limbo. Technically, she was still a princess, but also technically, she was a political object without a husband and without a clear future. Her dowry was in limbo, her reputation hung by a very Spanish thread. She lived in relative anonymity for 7 long years, waiting for fate and royal bureaucracy to decide what to do with her. Then, fate appeared with red hair and endless legs. Prince Henry entered the scene. When Henry VII died and 17-year-old Henry VIII ascended the throne, one of his first royal decisions was to marry Catherine. She was 5 years older, educated, beautiful, of a delicate refinement, and had the Spanish alliance in her bridal gift basket. He seemed really fond of her. For a time, they were the golden couple of England. Catherine became Queen of England and thrived in her role. She was dignified, adored by the people, fluent in ceremony, and compassionate. She even ruled as regent while Henry was away fighting in the war and crushed a Scottish rebellion at the Battle of Flodden, while very pregnant, like the absolute legend she was. But there was a problem, an insurmountable problem in the form of Anne. Henry wanted a son, and Catherine gave him Mary. Catalina endured at least 6 pregnancies, but only one son survived childhood, Princess Maria, the future Maria I. Even so, Catalina was not discouraged. She believed with all her heart that it was the will of God. She remained loyal to Enrique, loving him and feeling proud of him. But Enrique was becoming anxious. He convinced himself that the lack of male children was a punishment for having married his brother's wife, even though he was the one who promoted the marriage in. And then Anna de Boleyn arrived, and things went from being a little uncomfortable to catastrophic. Enrique wanted a divorce. Catalina naturally refused. She fought like a lioness defending her cubs. She defended her case before the courts, appeared before the bishops, and even before the Pope, and declared that she was Enrique's true legitimate wife. She knelt before him and said the famous phrase, "I have been to you a faithful, humble, and obedient wife, and if it were not for the displeasure of God, I would rather be buried than repudiated." "Mike, leave it." But Enrique had already decided, with Onbean whispering in his ear and his ego clamoring for a son. He broke with the Catholic Church, invented his own, because why not, and declared the marriage null. Catalina was banished from the court, stripped of her title, separated from her daughter, and sent to live in increasingly gloomy castles. She refused to accept her degradation and insisted until the end that she was Enrique's only legitimate wife and the legitimate Queen of England. She died in 1536, at 50, alone, but not broken, and when it was later discovered that her heart was blackened, some whispered that she was poisoned, but I prefer to think that she was simply too full of pain. Catalina de Aragon was faithful to her God, to her crown, and to her daughter. She was intelligent, had political skill, and was deeply loved by the English people. Even in exile, she behaved with the elegance of a queen and the iron will of a general. She lost the crown, she lost her husband, but she never lost her dignity, and her daughter Maria, one day, would occupy the throne. Catalina's lineage would shine brightly again, even if only for a while. A crown crowned by love and destroyed by power. Once upon a time, in the late 15th century, in the lush countryside of Kent, a girl was born into a family whose ambition was almost as great as that of the royal families they wanted to impress. Her name was Anna Boleyn, and Although the exact year of her birth is still debated, some say it was in 1501 and others in 1507. What is beyond doubt is that this girl would become a woman who would turn the kingdom of England upside down, not with armies or armor, but with her intellect, intrigue, and dazzling and dangerous charm, and was not the daughter of a king or even a duchess. Her father, Thomas B., was a skilled diplomat, sharp-tongued and tireless in his pursuit of status, while her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from one of the noblest families in England. Together they gave in a childhood marked not by great castles and royal protocols, but by education, exposure to the world, and expectations, and was not raised to be queen, but to shine, and at an early age was sent abroad to serve in the courts of the continent, where she received a much richer and more sophisticated education than most English ladies of the time could dream of. First, she went to the court of Archduchess Margarita in the Netherlands, where she learned languages, etiquette, and diplomacy. Then she traveled to France to serve Queen Claudia, wife of King Francisco I, and it was there that Anna really flourished, immersing herself in French fashion, art, courtly flirtation, and the ideals of the Renaissance. She learned to speak not only eloquently, but also with seduction, nuance, and wit, and returned to England mastering both the language and the art of seducing. When she entered the court of Enrique VIII, Anna Bolena was not only beautiful, although her dark eyes, olive skin, and long, elegant neck certainly attracted attention, but she was also elegant, intelligent, and magnetic, unlike her sister Maria, who had been the king's mistress and was often dismissed as a pleasant but forgettable affair. Anna demanded more. She refused to be one more name on the list of the king's lovers, and she was often dismissed as a pleasant but forgettable affair. And demanded more. She refused to be one more name on the... If he wanted her, he would have to make her his wife, and so began one of the most infamous and transformative romances in European history. Enrique VII, already married to Catalina de Aragon, was totally and irrevocably captivated by Anna's spirit. She was not submissive or giggling like the ladies he was used to, but self-confident, defiant, and tantalizingly elusive. For Anna, the stakes were incredibly high. Becoming the king's mistress could raise her family's fortune, yes, but aspiring to the crown required precision, ambition, and nerves of steel. Enrique pursued her obsessively, writing her passionate love letters full of longing and jealousy, promising her anything, everything, if she would be his. Yes, we still have them. Yes, they're juicy, but Anna, calculating and cautious, refused to give in until he put the crown on her head. She would not be another discarded favorite. She would be Enrique's queen. The persecution became obsession, and obsession became despair. He appealed to the Pope to grant him the annulment of the marriage with Catalina, citing the scriptures and divine punishment, alleging that his marriage to his brother's widow was cursed by God, as demonstrated by Catherine's inability to give him a male heir. But the Pope, entangled in European politics and unwilling to anger the powerful Emperor Carlos I, Catalina's nephew, refused to grant it, so Enrique did what any egocentric and power-drunk monarch would do in the face of resistance. He proclaimed himself the new head of the Church of England, separated from Rome, and forced his nation to choose between obedience to the Pope and loyalty to his increasingly deranged king. In 1533, Enrique and Anna secretly married shortly after Anna was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony, as grand as the coronation of any monarch, although not without murmurs and sideways glances from public that still adored Catalina. Anna, now visibly pregnant, walked proudly through Westminster Abbey in golden dresses, enjoying the moment she had orchestrated so carefully, but fate seemed to have a cruel sense of irony. Anna gave birth later that year to a daughter, Isabel, a bright and fiery girl destined to become one of the most legendary monarchs in history. But Enrique, at that time, was bitterly disappointed. He had risked his soul and shattered his kingdom for Anna, and what he wanted, what he needed, what he demanded was a son. Anna's power, so quickly gained, began to fade, although she remained Enrique's wife and Queen of Enrique. Her position was never secure, since she had made many enemies in court for being too stubborn, too influential, and too much like the king himself in her refusal to play the role of obedient wife. Her second and third pregnancies ended in miscarriage, one of them tragically after suffering a shock, perhaps from witnessing Enrique's fall in a jousting accident or from learning of his growing flirtation with a quiet lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. The same court that once applauded her rise now whispered about her fall. In 153, only 3 years after becoming queen, Anna was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges against her were shocking and suspiciously convenient: adultery, incest, treason. Her own brother was among those accused. The trial, as you can imagine, was less a legal procedure and more like an execution in slow motion. Anna, always eloquent and serene, defended herself fiercely, but it was clear the verdict was written long before the trial began. On May 19th, Anna was led to the scaffold. She wore a dark dress and a grace mantle. She wore her hair up under the infamous French hood that had become her hallmark. She gave a last dignified, calm, disturbingly serene speech, and did not blame the king, but praised him, as was expected of a queen facing death. Then, with a single clean blow from the French executioner's sword, she vanished. She was just over 30 years old. The story of Anna did not end with her death, but began there because the daughter she gave birth to, Isabel, would become one of the greatest rulers the world has ever known, and the reformation that she unleashed with her marriage would resonate throughout the centuries, changing not only England, but the landscape of Western religion. Anna was not a victim, nor a simple villain, nor even just a queen. She was a revolution wrapped in silk and steel, a woman who dared to ask for more, and, although the world tried to reduce her size, her shadow extends throughout history. Now, dear dreamer, close your eyes, but not your ears, because another queen waits just behind the veil. She was quiet where Anna was bold. She yielded where Anna was fiery, and yet, in the king's eyes, she was the one who gave him the only thing he desired more than love or loyalty, a son. Jane Seymour, the silent queen who gave England its precious prince in a world ablaze with ambition, egos, and the eternal chess game of politics. Jane Seymour entered history not with a thunder, but with a whisper, soft and silky, intertwined with that kind of discreet determination that would end up captivating a king and securing him a place in the turbulent tapestry of the Tudor court. She was not a great beauty, nor did she have a fiery intellect, nor was she an outrageous temptress. She was not a revolutionary like in Boleyn, nor a powerful woman like Catherine of Aragon, but she was something much rarer in the environment of Henry V. She was quiet, cautious, and intelligent enough to survive, at least for a while. Born around 1508 in Wolf Hall, Wiltshire, Jane came from an old and respectable noble family, although much less ambitious and ostentatious than the Boleyns. Her father, Sir John Seymour, had loyally served Henry for years, and her mother, Margaret Wentworth, was known for her gentle wisdom and piety. Jane, one of the children, was raised in a home where discipline, obedience, and modesty were the most prized virtues, and perhaps nowhere were those lessons internalized more deeply than in Jane herself. She did not have a particularly good education compared to her predecessors, unlike Anna, who spoke French, Latin, and sarcasm fluently. Jane's talent lay more in sewing, music, and household management, but she had something much more powerful in court than languages or wit. She understood silence. Jane knew how to listen, how to nod, how to move through dangerous rooms without leaving footprints, and in the treacherous corridors of Henry's court, that made her completely lethal in the gentlest and sweetest way possible. Jane served as lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon and later to Boleyn, which means she was in a perfect position to witness both the rise and the brutal fall of the two queens who preceded her. She saw Catalina be dethroned after decades of loyalty and saw how Anne's meteoric rise to power crumbled under the weight of lost pregnancies, political shifts, and Jane waited as and fought fiercely to keep her crown. Jane stayed close to the king, but never too close. She let herself be seen, but did not pursue. She never argued, she never demanded. She offered Henry something he hadn't had in years: peace, simplicity, and the promise of a new beginning. Some say she played the role of the demure maiden with deliberate precision, accepting Henry's gifts, but refusing to become his lover unless she was made his wife. Others say she was nothing more than a puppet in a game orchestrated by her ambitious brothers Eduardo and Thomas Seymour, who saw in her pale hands the key to rising in the ranks of power. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Henry fell deeply in love, and as Anna's fortune waned, especially after her last miscarriage in January 1536, Jane's star began to rise in May of that year. And Boleyn was dead, executed on charges that still spark debate among historians and playwrights. Only 11 days later, Henry and Jane married. No great father, no mourning period, just a quick turn from one queen's grave to another's. Jane Seymour was everything and Boleyn had not been: docile, gentle, and politically cautious. She restored order to the royal household, recovered many of the customs and courtiers who had been expelled under Anne's reign, and worked quietly to reconcile Henry with his daughter Mary, whom he had declared illegitimate after divorcing Catherine of Aragon. Jane may have been reserved, but she was not without influence. She knew when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. The only time she challenged Henry, begging him to restore the Catholic monasteries and denouncing the harsh treatment of religious rebels during the Pilgrimage of Grace, he snapped at her to remember what had happened to the last queen who meddled. Jane never insisted on the subject again, but focused all her energy on the role that would define her legacy: motherhood. In the fall of 1537, after more than a year of difficulties during pregnancy and increasing pressure, Jane Seymour gave birth to what Henry had long considered the true purpose of marriage: a legitimate and healthy male heir. The boy, named Eduardo, was born after a difficult labor that lasted 2 days and 3 nights, an exhausting and painful ordeal that left Jane physically weakened and seriously ill. Even so, the birth was greeted with celebrations throughout the country. Bells rang throughout England, bonfires were lit, and people danced in the streets. Henry VII, after years of failed marriages, love disappointments, and political chaos, finally had a son, and Jane, for the first time in her life, had it all: a crown, the king's love, and the boy who made her not only queen, but the mother of England's future. But fate, cruel as always in fairy tales, had other plans. Only 12 days later, Jane Seymour died, probably of puerperal fever, a common and often fatal infection after childbirth. Her death plunged the court into genuine mourning. Even Henry, who was not known for his emotional vulnerability, unless yelling at someone counts, was truly devastated. He mourned for months, did not remarry for several years, and declared that Jane had been his true wife, the only one who had given him what he had always wanted. When his end finally came, he asked to be buried next to her. Jane Seymour governed for only 17 months, and, in that brief time, she left behind no scandal, no disgrace, and no rebellion. She did not reform religion, nor did she write passionate letters, nor did she fall into disgrace with a sword on her neck, but she did what no other wife of Henry VII could do. She gave birth to a son, secured his rise to power, and died before the king could turn against her. History remembers her as a quiet, modest, even boring woman, but there is cunning in silence and power in stillness. In a court of roaring lions and screeching hawks, Jane Seymour was the white dove, elegant, elusive, and gone too soon. And now, dear dreamer, as the shadows lengthen and the echoes of courtly lullabies slip through the halls, another figure appears in the doorway. She wears no crown, only a knowing smile and a keen sense of opportunity. She arrived with a flattering portrait and left with a royal pension in her head. And of Cleves, the queen who knew when to retire, the woman who married the most dangerous man in England and yet managed to leave richer, safer, and with a better real estate portfolio than most modern influencers. Our story does not begin in the elegant chaos of the English court, but on the other side of the canal, in the quiet and structured town of Cleves, in what we now call Germany. It was the early 16th century, and young and born in 1515, was growing up far from the scandalous pages of Tudor history, of which she would one day be the protagonist, and was not royalty, but she was noble, daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, and Maria of Woolburg, rulers of a region known for its piety, modesty, and let's put it this way, for a more practical than glamorous education. The girls of Cleves did not spend their days perfecting court dances or learning to flirt in French, but received an education, certainly, but with a more restricted domestic discipline, learning to sew, play music, and walk without tripping over a 9-meter skirt, presumably unlike the English court, where every look was a game and every smile could be a trap, and grew up in an environment that valued tranquility, humility, and simplicity, and for a time she probably imagined that her life would be very similar to that of her homeland, structured, respectable, and free of beheadings. But on the other side of the sea, King Henry VII was once again looking for a wife, and Anne's name had just entered the list of candidates. In 1539, Henry was a widower for the third time. Catalina de Aragon had been divorced and exiled, and Boleyn had seen her life dramatically shortened. And Jane Seymour, sweet Jane, had died tragically after giving him the son he had so longed for. Now, at almost 50 years old, Henry felt alone, a little grumpy, and increasingly festively chubby. He was still powerful, he was still dangerous, but his mirror no longer reflected the golden prince of years past. Meanwhile, Europe was a political pressure cooker. England was moving away from Catholic Rome and needed Protestant allies. The Duke of Cleves, who was Protestant and in a strategic location, seemed like a promising partner, and he had a single daughter. A treaty was proposed and a marriage was discussed, but Henry, always romantic and not at all superficial, wanted to see what he was getting into before signing any royal contract. Enter Hans Holbein, court painter, an unwitting bearer of chaos. Holbein was sent to paint Anne's portrait, a formal and flattering image of a young and serene woman, with delicate features and rich dresses. Henry saw the finished painting and fell in love instantly. "She is pretty," he probably said as he wiped the turkey grease from his chin. They all do this for a part, and had no idea what she was getting into. In January 1540, Anne of Cleves arrived in England. The court was in an uproar. Henry was excited and planned a surprise meeting, because what better way to receive your future wife than to ambush her disguised as a sweaty character from Shakespeare? Unfortunately, this did not go well. When Henry burst into her chambers pretending to be a gallant stranger, because Henry liked role-playing, and who had been educated in a strict and proper environment, where that type of behavior was considered totally inappropriate, responded with a very polite, "Who are you and why are you touching me?" Henry, humiliated and discouraged, decided that he had been deceived by a portrait. It is said that he called Anne Flanders Mare behind closed doors, a cruel and infamous comment that probably had more to do with his own insecurity than with Anne's real appearance to worry. He decided that he had been deceived by a portrait. It is said that he called her Flanders Mare behind closed doors, a cruel and infamous comment that probably had more to do with his own insecurity than with Anne's real appearance. Most accounts agree that Anne was attractive, although not in the overly refined and Frenchified way that Henry preferred. She simply did not shine with flirting or flattery, and for a man like Henry, that was practically treason. Even so, a treaty had been signed, the wedding date had been set, and the alliance was crucial. So despite his complaints, Henry married Anne on January 6, 1540. To say that the marriage was a disaster is generous. Henry claimed that he could not consummate the union, alleging lack of attraction. Some historians suggest that it was more about his health, his ulcers, his mood swings, and the crushing realization that he was no longer as virile as before. For her part, Anne was probably confused and disconcerted. She had done everything she had been asked to do. She dressed correctly, spoke gracefully, tried her best, but Henry's affection was already fading, this time towards a young and flirtatious lady of the court named Catalina Howard. In June, the die was cast. Henry wanted to get out of there and, instead of fighting, begging, or crying like her predecessors, did something extraordinary. She accepted. She said yes. She let him go. She accepted the annulment, alleging the non-consummation of the marriage and the previous contracts of betrothal, and, in exchange, she won the sweet life of not being married to Henry VII. And of Cleves was granted a generous compensation. She received Hever Castle, ironically the old estate of the Boleyns, several jewels, staff, and the honorary title of Sister of the King. She remained in England, attended royal events, and even got along surprisingly well with Henry and his children, particularly with Princess Elizabeth, who visited her frequently. She never remarried, never returned to Cleves, and, unlike most of Henry's wives, never suffered disgrace, imprisonment, or a sudden fall from grace. She lived comfortably for another 17 years, outliving Henry, Catalina Howard, and Catalina Parr. She died in 1557, at the age of 41 or 42, and was buried in Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives who rested there. History often overlooks and of Cleves as the ugly one, the failed marriage, the brief relationship between the drama of Anne Boleyn and the tragedy of Catherine Howard. But that is not fair, far from it, and was wise, diplomatic, and had enough survival instinct to recognize that when married to a man with a sword and a bad temper, sometimes surrendering is surviving. She was not the wife Henry wanted, but she was the only one who left on her own terms, kept her head, her money, and, most importantly, her peace. And now, dear dreamer, while the candles are consumed and the air thickens with secrets, the next queen waits in shadow. She is young, too young, beautiful, vivacious, naive, and her story will end more like a Boleyn's than like Anne of Cleves. Catherine Howard, the rose without thorns and the crown without future, a girl who danced too close to the fire. Once upon a time, not long after Anne of Cleves made her elegant exit from Henry's suffocating affection, a new presence slipped into the royal court like perfume in the summer air, sweet, bright, intoxicating, and utterly doomed. Her name was Catherine Howard, and she was little more than a girl when she caught the eye of a king old enough to be her grandfather and dangerous enough to be her executioner. Born around 1523, a date that makes historians sigh and shuffle cards, Catherine was a cousin of the infamous Anne Boleyn, which should have come with a warning label that said, "Handle with care. May attract kings and misfortunes." She was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a man who, to put it mildly, was not exactly prosperous, had more debts than dignity, and the Howard family, although noble, was scattered throughout England like old butter on burnt toast. When Catherine was still very young, her mother died, and her father, probably overwhelmed and unqualified, sent her to live in the care of her widowed grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in what could generously be called a boarding school for girls with tutors, and, less generously, described as absolute chaos with embroidery. Catherine's education was informal. The Duchess's house was large, lively, and alarmingly unsupervised. It was there that Catherine, who had barely entered her teens, was exposed to flirting, music, stolen kisses behind tapestries, and men who treated courtship as a sport. Two of those men, Henry Manx, her music teacher, and Francis Derham, a bolder suitor, played a key role in her youth. Although modern historians still debate the full extent of those entanglements, what is certain is that Catherine's name was already linked to rumors long before she donned the crown, and, suddenly, everything changed. It changed in 1540, at just 17 years old, when Catherine was appointed lady-in-waiting to the newly crowned Anne of Cleves. And it was there, in the dazzling court of silks and secrets, that King Henry VIII, now 50 years old, overweight and plagued by ulcers both physical and emotional, noticed the pretty, laughing teenager with brown hair and dimples like sweet wine. For Henry, Catherine Howard was a second spring, a last gasp of youth before the grave. She was vivacious, full of life, and, most importantly, seemed absolutely delighted with him. Whether that delight was genuine or part of a careful performance, we may never know. But for the increasingly bitter and bloated king, Catherine was a balm, a distraction, a dream. In July 1540, Just 19 days after annulling his marriage to and of Cleves, Henry married Catherine Howard, who became Queen of England, a teenager on the arm of a man who now wore padding under his robes and needed help climbing the stairs. But she played her part well, dancing, smiling, adoring him, and even calling him his thornless rose. A tremendously optimistic nickname for a man who had already executed one wife and discarded another, as if she were yesterday's roast goose. Still, for a while, Catherine wore jewelry as if it had been made for her, threw parties, embraced music, and revived the youthful glamour of the court, but the shadows of her past were beginning to stir. Rumors are common currency, and secrets are weapons. As Catherine adjusted to her new role, Francis Derham, the former love of her crazy adolescence, arrived at court and tried to position himself to achieve power. It is unclear whether she granted him a position out of fear, affection, or blackmail, but his presence was a fatal mistake, even more dangerous because Catherine had begun a new affair, this time with Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber, young, handsome, and close to Henry. Their relationship, possibly romantic, possibly physical, was reckless, as only a teenager with a crown could be. The dates were arranged in secret with the help of one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn. Yes, that Jane Boleyn, the widow of and Boleyn, who had already seen a queen fall and was apparently willing to roll the dice again. But in the court, where nothing remained secret for long, rumors soon reached the ears of Archbishop Cranmer, and from there galloped straight to the king. The moment Henry learned of the allegations against Catherine, everything stopped. He had loved her, or at least loved the way she made him feel young again. The betrayal, whether real or exaggerated by gossip, hit him like an axe to the heart. He cried, raged, refused to see her, refused to believe it, and then demanded proof. Once he had them, letters, testimonies, confessions, his pain turned, as always, into revenge. Catherine was stripped of her title, confined to her chambers, and eventually imprisoned in Showne Abbey, where she fell prey to panic. Unlike in Boleyn, who had met her death with disturbing calm, Catherine broke down, begged for mercy, screamed, and temporarily went mad from fear. When she was told she would be executed, she asked for the block to be brought to her, so she could practice how to place her head on it. She was barely 18 years old when, on February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was taken to the Tower of London. She wore a black velvet dress and her hair loose. She confessed, prayed, and then placed her head on the block and joined the long list of women who had loved the wrong man at the wrong time in history. Catherine Howard's story is tragic not only because of how it ended, but because of the little time she had to live it. She was not an intriguer or a seductress with a master plan. She was a girl thrown into the lion's den of politics, a pawn in the hands of powerful families, and a girl whose charm became her death sentence. She was not perfect, but she was never really prepared. She made mistakes, yes, but she also brought joy to a man whom no one else could please, and laughed, danced, and loved even as the walls closed in around her. She is often remembered as a fool, but she deserves to be remembered as a human being. And now, dear dreamer, as the candle goes out and the palace halls fall silent, there is another queen waiting to be heard. She was intelligent, gentle, and ultimately the last wife to outlive him. Catherine Parr, the queen who read books, dodged swords, and buried her husband. There are women who are born to be queens, and then there are women who become queens because they are too smart, too strong, and frankly, too organized to avoid it. Catherine Parr, the sixth and last wife of Henry VIII, was undoubtedly one of the latter. She did not arrive at court with starry eyes nor great dreams of royal romance. When Henry knocked on her door, Catherine had already lived through 2 husbands, an outbreak of plague, several religious revolutions, and at least a dozen reasons not to get involved with a man known for solving marital problems with an axe. But she got involved because this dear dreamer is not just a love story. It is a survival guide in a corset. Catherine Parr was born in 1512, daughter of Thomas Parr, a courtier and close friend of Henry VIII. Yes, that Henry, yes, the one who got everywhere. Her mother, Maud Green, was a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon and passed on to her not only courtly skills, but also a deep admiration for the dignity and strength of the original queen, qualities that the young Catherine would eventually embody in her own right, unlike Henry's other wives. Catherine's childhood was not full of luxuries, but of loss and learning. Her father died when she was little, and her first two marriages, first with Edward Berg, a sickly noble, and then with John Neville, Baron of Latimer, an older and kind widower with political burdens, were more out of duty than out of desire. She spent years managing homes, acting as stepmother, surviving rebellions, and quietly becoming one of England's most cultured women. Catalina spoke several languages, read Latin and Greek, and was deeply interested in religion, not in the rigid Catholicism of her youth, but in the nascent wave of the Protestant Reformation that spread through Europe like wildfire and made everyone become enlightened or deeply suspicious, depending on their level of conservatism. When she became a widow for the second time, Catalina was older than most brides by 30 years. She was twice a widow and seemed perfectly satisfied retiring from love and leading a quiet life dedicated to study and devotion. And then, of course, Henry VII appeared. At that moment in history, Henry was 15 years old, obese, suffered from chronic diseases, was prone to mood swings, paranoia, and gout, which was so severe he could barely walk. In addition, he smelled of infected ulcers on his leg. Despite everything, he was the King of England, and when he decided he wanted something or someone, that was it. Henry noticed Catalina's kindness, her intelligence, and her bearing, and, to her dismay, he also noticed her beauty, which, by all accounts, was calm and elegant. She was tall, blonde, and behaved with dignity rather than drama. In short, she was not going to stage scandals, have affairs, or demand revolutions after 5 previous wives, which sounded very attractive. But here is the twist. Catalina did not want to marry him. Her heart actually belonged to another man, Thomas Seymour, a handsome courtier and, yes, brother of the late Jane Seymour. The Tudors were really a closed system, huh? But when the king proposes, even if he is a bit repulsive and terrifying, you say yes. So in 1543, Catherine Parr became Queen of England. Queen Catherine's life was a balancing act of astonishing complexity. She was married to a volatile monarch and helped raise his 3 surviving children, Maria, Isabel, and Eduardo, each with a very different religious education and political destiny. She also worked silently, but forcefully, to reconcile the royal family, especially Henry and his daughters, who had been expelled from the line of succession. Catalina's court was calm, cultured, and intellectual. She surrounded herself with scholars, poets, and theologians. She even wrote and published books, something unheard of for a Queen of England. Her most famous prayers or meditations were a bestseller in her time, which in Tudor England meant that they were not immediately banned and burned, but her interest in them soon aroused suspicions. Catalina read forbidden texts, welcomed reformist thinkers, and even discussed theology with Henry, which was a dangerous game when your husband had a history of turning theological disagreements into public executions. At one point, Henry became convinced, or was convinced by others, that Catalina was a heretic. Reportedly, an arrest warrant was issued against her, but Catalina, in an impressive display of quick wit and survival instinct, went to the king and prostrated herself at his swollen feet, telling him that she had only argued with him to distract him from his pain and demonstrate her loyalty. Henry, flattered and appeased, canceled the arrest warrant, and she survived once more. Catalina's luck. In 1547, only 4 years after her marriage, Henry VII died. She was his 6th wife and the only one who survived him. She was finally free, but instead of sinking into a quiet widowhood, Catalina did something surprising. She married for love, openly and quickly, a few months after Henry's death, and reunited with Thomas Seymour, the charming man she had wanted to marry before the king claimed her. This should have been the end of her fairy tale, but, unfortunately, it was a disaster. Thomas was ambitious, fickle, and, let's say, not very good at avoiding flirting with teenagers. While married to Catalina, he became too fond of the young Princess Isabel, who lived in his house at that time. The whole affair was uncomfortable, scandalous, and emotionally devastating for Catalina, who had spent so many years surviving the storm only to discover that she had been betrayed in her own home. Even so, she gave Thomas a daughter, her only daughter, and died shortly after giving birth in 1548, probably of puerperal fever, the same fate that had claimed Jane Seymour before her. She was only 36 years old. Catherine Parr was not the most famous of Henry VIII's wives, nor the most tragic, nor the most scandalous, but in many ways, she was the strongest. She used her intelligence, her compassion, and her formidable patience not only to survive but to lead, influence, and leave a mark on England that extended far beyond the crown. She brought peace to a fractured royal family, raised the future Queen Isabel I, and modeled a type of power that does not require a sword or a scream. She loved, lost, loved again, and, in the end, she chose herself. Thus ends the story of the 6 wives of Henry VII. 6 women, 6 lives, each of them altered forever by a man's desire to have a son, a legacy, and a love that he never deserved. Some were discarded, others destroyed, one survived him, and all of them, dear dreamer, lived in the pages of history as queens, as survivors, and as the enduring echo of a crown that was never entirely calm. And now, after all the drama and heartbreak of the 6 wives, it is time to meet the daughter of heartbreak, Maria Tudor. She was the daughter of a marriage that ended in exile, the girl who saw her world fall apart before she was old enough to understand why. The first woman to rule England in her own right, and the queen that history has feared, longed for, and misunderstood. So lift your royal blanket of velvet, take a deep breath, and let us delve into a story full of pain, survival, and fire. Maria Tudor, the queen with a crown of thorns and a heart full of ashes. Long before she was known by the name that would make even schoolchildren laugh at her, Bloody Mary, she was a little girl with golden red hair, delicate hands, and eyes full of nostalgia. She was born in 1516, the long-awaited daughter of King Henry VII and Queen Catalina of Aragon. And although she was not the male heir that her father desperately longed for, she was deeply loved by her mother, adored by the courtiers, and, at least for a time, appreciated by the king himself. Her childhood was elegant and privileged. Little Maria Tudor was spoiled, dressed in silks, and educated more as a prince than as a princess. Enrique saw in her the future of his legacy. If not a king, at least a queen who could marry well, forge alliances, and continue with the name of the Tudors. She was witty, charming, and precociously intelligent, and mastered Latin, French, music, and theology before most children knew how to write their own names. But love in Tudor England was no guarantee of stability, and Maria's world was about to collapse when Enrique VII decided to divorce her mother, Catalina de Aragon. Everything changed for Maria. She was only 11 years old when her father began his infamous pursuit of Anna de Bergen, and when she was a teenager, her mother was banished, stripped of her title, and separated from her daughter. Maria, who was once the most beloved princess of England, was declared illegitimate, demoted to lady, and forbidden from seeing her mother. Despite everything, she was forced to serve in the house of her new half-sister Isabel, the baby born to Enrique and Anna, and war was declared between the Tudors, and the Borgia's beloved princess of England was declared illegitimate, demoted to Lady Maria, and forbidden to see her mother. Despite everything, she was forced to serve in the house of her new half-sister Isabel, the baby born from Enrique's second marriage to a proud devotee. For a heartbroken teenager, it was not only a degradation, but also a humiliation. Even in exile, Catalina urged her daughter to stand firm and refuse to recognize Anna as queen or Isabel as legitimate, and Maria did so bravely and stubbornly for years. But when her mother died in 1536, alone and in disgrace, Maria lost the only person who had truly protected her, and, shattered by grief and the threat of royal wrath, she was forced to sign a document renouncing her rights to the throne and recognizing her father as supreme head of the Church of England. It was a betrayal of her soul, and she never fully forgave him. The years that followed were strange and quiet. Maria lived like a ghost in her own father's court, present but never truly seen. She was allowed to enjoy some favor again, but she was always watched and treated with suspicion. The Protestant Reformation was taking root in England, and Maria, a staunch Catholic like her mother, was seen as a relic of the old faith, a threat to the new order. When Enrique died in 1547, his younger half-brother, Eduardo V, ascended the throne at only 9 years old, surrounded by Protestant advisors who wanted to eradicate Catholicism forever. Under his reign, Maria was once again pressured, harassed, and persecuted, forced to abandon her religion, to worship in English, to forget the Mass, the saints, and the prayers in Latin that had once been the heartbeat of her soul. She refused in silence, but firmly, even when her friends were arrested, and even when she was threatened with prison. Maria endured. She had learned to survive in silence. She had learned that sometimes the safest thing was to wait, and then her opportunity came when Eduardo died in 1553 at only 15 years old. He and his council tried to prevent Maria from inheriting the crown and named Lady Jane Grey, a distant cousin and devout Protestant, as queen, but they underestimated Maria. They believed her weak. They believed her forgotten. They believed that she had no allies. They were wrong. Maria, now 37 years old, left her mansion with flags waving, and England rose up around her. Peasants and nobles joined her side. Her faith, her lineage, and her unwavering dignity inspired a revolution. Lady Jane's reign lasted 9 days. Maria entered London to thunderous cheers. For the first time in the history of England, a woman claimed the throne by right, not by marriage, and for a moment all her sufferings seemed to lead to this. A crown, a throne, a triumph. But ruling is not the same as surviving, and Maria, although she was finally queen, ruled a kingdom that no longer resembled the world in which she had grown up. She was a Catholic queen in a Protestant land, a ruling woman in a world of men, and although she sought peace and unity, her reign soon became a spiral of suspicion, rebellion, and infamy. Determined to restore the Catholic faith in England, Maria reinstated the authority of the Pope and married Felipe II of Spain, a political union intended to strengthen ties with her mother's homeland. But the people hated the marriage. Felipe was foreign, cold, and ambitious, and Maria loved him more than he ever loved her. Then came the burnings in her effort to restore Catholicism. Maria's government executed nearly 300 Protestants by burning them at the stake for heresy. It was a brutal, public, and unforgivable act. The people, who were once so loyal to her, began to fear her and call her Maria the Bloody. But Maria sincerely believed that she was saving souls. She was not a sadist. She was a believer, a fanatic, a woman whose childhood had been shattered by religious turmoil and who was desperately trying to reunify England in the only way she knew how. Maria's marriage was a failure. Felipe spent most of his time abroad. She suffered multiple miscarriages, her wounds swelling with hope that turned into disillusionment again and again. She longed to have a child, not only to continue the Tudor line, but to keep the throne out of reach of her Protestant half-sister Isabel. But she had no children. In 1558, Maria was physically shattered, tormented by pain, possibly by ovarian cancer or some undiagnosed infection. Her heart was heavy, her people unsettled, and her legacy was already beginning to fade into darkness. She died on November 17th at the age of 42, leaving the crown to the same sister she had tried to disinherit. She was buried in Westminster Abbey under a simple tombstone. Years later, Isabel would be buried in the same tomb, and the inscription would read, "Companions on the throne and in the tomb." And what is most tragic of all is that history remembers her as Maria the Bloody, the queen who burned her people. But she was also the girl who lost her mother, the princess who was repudiated, the sister who fought for her crown, and the woman who ruled not with charm or ambition, but with relentless resistance. She was not a perfect queen, but she was a queen and paved the way for the greatest monarch England would ever know. And now, dear dreamer, the candles shine brighter. They do not go out, because in the shadows of Maria's pain, a flame is about to ignite, bright, defiant, dazzling in its rebellion. Isabel I, the queen who turned her ruin into a reign of glory when Isabel Tudor was born on September 7th, 1533 in the sumptuous halls of Greenwich Palace. With the autumn light filtering through the stained glass windows and the air filled with hope and anxiety, her arrival was not greeted with the joyful fanfare that her parents had desperately hoped for. For she was not the child for whom her father had divided his kingdom, nor the male heir around whom he had restructured the spiritual and political foundations of his nation. But she was a girl, a delicate, disappointing red-haired girl wrapped in diapers and shadows of expectations. Her mother, the infamous and dazzling Anna de Greenwich, had risen like lightning in the court, an intelligent and provocative woman whose ambition had cost Enrique his marriage to Catalina de Aragon, his alliance with the Pope, and his religious reputation. Now that her womb had not given birth to the promised son, her political position began to crumble like an old parchment left out in the open. When Isabel was barely 3 years old, she had lost everything that once assured her future. Her title of princess was revoked. Her place in the line of succession was declared illegitimate by parliamentary decree, and her mother, Anna, was executed by order of her father, accused of adultery, incest, and treason, accusations as charged with political connotations as probably false. From that moment on, Isabel's childhood was marked by the strange paradox of being both a member of royalty and irrelevant, important enough to be watched, but never quite welcome, sent to live in distant houses, moving from one home to another as an afterthought, raised by stepmothers who came and went like the seasons, and watched by a father who, although sometimes affectionate, could never look her in the eye without remembering the ghost of the wife he had destroyed. However, despite her precarious situation, Isabel received an education superior to the expectations for her gender. She was trained as a prince instead of as a lady, and she was entrusted to tutors who cultivated her fierce intelligence and taught her the disciplines of Latin, Greek, French, theology, logic, rhetoric, philosophy, and the history of both classical antiquity and the tumultuous world that was developing beyond the walls of the castle. At 10 years old, Isabel could already debate scholars, translate ancient texts, and write poetry with wit and elegance. At 15, she not only spoke 6 languages fluently, but had developed the keen observation skills of someone who knew that saying something inappropriate at the wrong time could mean imprisonment or worse. When her father died in 1547 and her half-brother Edward I ascended to the throne at the age of 9, the court became a dangerous, constantly shifting battlefield, marked by Protestant fervor, regency councils, and power-hungry nobles, all eager to manipulate or eliminate anyone who could challenge the fragile political order. Elizabeth, as a visible figure of royal blood and with a growing intellect, found herself walking a fine line between cautious loyalty and the imminent threat of betrayal or irrelevance. Her sister Maria, a devout and fiercely proud Catholic, ascended the throne in 1553 after the brief and tragic 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey. Almost immediately, Isabel became an object of suspicion, a symbol of Protestant resistance, whether she wanted this or not. She was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London on suspicion of supporting a rebellion she probably knew nothing about, locked in the same rooms where her mother had awaited execution, with the shadow of death enveloping her like frost. But Isabel did not break. She resisted, drafted careful and ambiguous letters, and defended her innocence with just enough sincerity to be believed and enough cunning to survive. After several terrifying months of isolation, she was released under surveillance and allowed to return to the countryside, resuming her performance of obedience, knowing that her life could end with a single signature. When Maria died, childless in 1558, Isabel entered London not only as the last heiress of the Tudors, but as a survivor, a woman who had survived the dangerous reigns of her father, her brother, and her sister, and who had navigated the jaws of political and religious turmoil with nothing more than her intelligence, her caution, and her unwavering belief that she was born for something more than exile or decoration. She was 25 years old, blonde-haired, with luminous eyes and a presence that could calm a crowded room with a single glance, and she was queen from the beginning of her reign. Isabel knew that she was expected to marry, not only because a queen who ruled alone was considered unnatural, dangerous, and vulnerable to manipulation, but because the continuation of the Tudor dynasty and the peace of the kingdom seemed to depend on producing a legitimate male heir. But Elizabeth, ever a strategist, refused to cede her power to a man, refused to tie herself to the ambitions of foreign princes or national nobles, and instead cultivated an entire mythology around her identity as a singular sovereign woman, declaring herself married to her kingdom, her crown, and her people, weaving the narrative of the Virgin Queen with such mastery that she turned it into a divine advantage. She kept her suitors dancing to her tune for decades. Felipe II of Spain, Archduke Carlos of Austria, the Duke of Anjou, and others offered her the possibility of an alliance without ever closing the deal, using her singleness as a diplomatic tool, bargaining chip, and cloak of independence that allowed her to stay out of marriages between factions at court. She surrounded herself with witty, brilliant, and loyal men. William Cecil, her advisor and support, Francis Walsingham, her spymaster and silent sword, and Robert Dudley, her favorite lover, a man whose intimacy with the Queen was the subject of endless speculation, jealousy, and scandalous rumors, but whom she never married, possibly because she knew that even love, if formalized, could threaten her throne. And it worked. Isabel's reign marked the beginning of a period of relative stability, economic growth, and artistic flourishing that went down in history as the Elizabethan Golden Age, an era in which poets, playwrights, and philosophers flourished like roses after the rain. When William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and Ben Jonson turned the English language into something new, alive, and full of fire, and when theaters, music, and masks became not only entertainment, but national pride. She navigated international waters with the same mixture of charm and ferocity that had defined her rise, playing the dangerous game of European politics with great skill, supporting Protestant causes abroad without committing to open war, sponsoring explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, who claimed new lands and filled the English coffers with gold and stories. And finally, when provoked beyond endurance, she rose up against the most powerful empire in the world when the Spanish Armada set sail for England in 1588, a fleet of imposing ships destined to crush her reign and restore Catholic power. Isabel did not cower, but put on a breastplate, rode to her troops in Tilbury, and declared in one of the most emblematic speeches in royal history that, although she had the body of a weak and fragile woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king, and moreover of a king of England. And when the Armada was defeated not only by English courage, but also by storms and divine fortune, the legend of Isabel was sealed. As the decades passed, Isabel remained single, childless, and increasingly isolated. Her old friends died, her favorites faded, her throne was safe, but her heart was increasingly alone. She wore the crown like armor. Her powdered face and towering wigs were a kind of royal theater, a spectacle to distract from the fragility that was taking hold of her, that was hiding underneath. And although she danced less, laughed less, and trusted fewer people than ever, she never stopped ruling. She died in 1603, at the age of 69, after having reigned for 44 years. She was the last monarch of the Tudor dynasty, and perhaps the greatest. She left no heir, but she left a legacy. Isabella was not destined to be queen. She was not born to rule. She was born as a disappointment, daughter of a disgraced mother and a father who had ordered the death of her mother's death. But she transformed herself into Gloriana, into Astria, into the Virgin Queen. Queen, into a woman so powerful, so luminous, and so incredibly brilliant that generations would look back on her reign and call it a golden age. She proved that a woman could rule, not as a mere substitute, not as a wife, not as a pornographic queen, but as a sovereign. She took the broken pieces of a ruined dynasty and forged an era of art, exploration, identity, and myth with them. And although her lineage ended with her, her story became legend. And so, Dear dreamer, as the flame of the candle flickers against the velvet of the night, let us remember her not only as a queen, not only as a ruler, but as a survivor, a woman of impossible will and infinite brilliance who changed the course of history simply by refusing to be anything less than extraordinary.